Hey guys, welcome to the 4th edition of the SEA Scavenger Hunt. I'm Javier.
And my name is Sheng, and we will be your game masters for this week.
Since we have never won an edition of the SEA Scavenger Hunt,
We will want to instead challenge you to complete this week's hunt. It will be the most difficult challenge that you have ever seen.
good luck and have fun. Bye.
Bye!
My life is brilliant. My life is brilliant. My love is pure. I saw an angel, of that I'm sure. She smiled at me on the subway. She was with another man, but I won't lose no sleep on that, 'cause I've got a plan. You're beautiful. You're beautiful. You're beautiful, it's true. I saw your face in a crowded place, and I don't know what to do, 'cause I'll never be with you. Yes, she caught my eye as we walked on by. She could see from my face that I was flying high, and I don't think that I'll see her again, but we shared a moment that will last till the end. You're beautiful. You're beautiful. You're beautiful, it's true. I saw your face in a crowded place, and I don't know what to do, 'cause I'll never be with you. La-la-la-la. La-la-la-la. Da-da-da-da-da. You're beautiful. You're beautiful. You're beautiful, it's true. There must be an angel with a smile on her face when she thought up that I should be with you. But it's time to face the truth. I will never be with you.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the DJ Anesh podcast series, bringing you the best in Southeast Asian history. We are voted the best Southeast Asian history podcast in River Valley High School right now. Some said we wouldn't get here, but we did. Look where we are. We started from the bottom. Look where we at. Word, yo. Thank you for your loyal support. Thank you for all the love that you've shown us, and I hope that this program will continue to go on as long as it can go. Of course, we're always looking out for sponsorship deals, as we are talking about the topic of economic development of Southeast Asia right now. We do know, and we've been through this before, that foreign direct investments are an important and essential component of any economic growth. So too, can I apply such principles to this podcast? We are looking for sponsors. KFC, here's a shout out to you. Oh, by the way, I think I should give everyone some updates about this KFC situation. I did enter a KFC contest this week. I think as you are hearing this podcast, it will still be ongoing. I hope to win a meal. we hope to win a meal. And yeah, this will be something to shout about in our next podcast if we really do win this thing. I put in the comments, it's a comments contest, and I put in the comments that something to do with like what do you want to say about KFC and things like that. And I said, oh yeah, I've just been teaching my students video conferencing while eating KFC. Of course, that hasn't happened yet. But once we win, we can really dream about such a situation, can we? Well, I hope that you've got whatever food or drink that you need as we go into this podcast. Thank you for joining me once again. Hope that it will be useful for you, this podcast. Today we are going to be talking about the socialist economies in Southeast Asia. It's a topic that I quite like actually, because it's something that we don't often think about enough. I think when it comes to the economy, we lean or we are exposed more towards capitalism. But today I want to look at socialist economies, and in the same way that we view authoritarianism, or in the same way that we view militarism in Southeast Asia, I kind of want to give a context for socialist economic planning, and I want us to see the reasons why governments would adopt such models, or at least would adopt certain components of such models. Keep in mind our framework that we have three models of the economy to consider: capitalist, number one; socialist, number two; and then the third way, hybrid economy, is number three. So even if governments don't wholly adopt socialist economic models, I think they do adopt at least some of the essential elements of socialist models and incorporate it into their capitalist framework. So that's the third way, hybrid economies, which I do believe that most Southeast Asian nations eventually move towards too. So yeah, if you guys are ready, we'll get your notes up. If you can view it on the PDF, and you can get your writing materials, write down notes and all that, we can begin. I can't promise you today that there won't be the coughing ASMR, because yep, I've had coffee. And I aim to please with my coughing ASMR as and when it appears. Just a forewarning about that right now. So guys, if you're ready, we will go ahead. Now, today we are going to be talking about the socialist economies in Southeast Asia. Again, like what the intro suggested, I would suggest that we don't immediately view these socialist models in a negative light. I know we have certain perceptions of it, especially as they function in the context of the Cold War. And we do know that the USSR collapsed because of their socialist economic planning. But yeah, I think let's keep an open mind first, and then we'll see how things developed in the case studies that I have to introduce to you. Also, one of the things that I would like you to consider is that this key determinant of ideology, economic ideology for that matter, it plays a huge part in economic planning as well, because economic ideology sets about the spirit of the economy, the general direction, the key sectors of focus, the dynamics between the state and non-state actors. A lot of these kind of things, the characteristics of an economy, is set by the ideological model that any government wants to impose for the economy. Is it as rigid as it is, like this is a capitalist economy, this is a socialist economy? I don't know about that. Judging by the trends in Southeast Asia, I think that it became more of hybrid situations. But for instance, if an essay gives you a given factor about capitalism, or gives you a given factor about socialism, then even if you believe in a hybrid even if you believe in a hybrid situation, you would also need to deal with the given factor of capitalism or socialism first. So that means to say that with regards to the ideological components, its essential features, you would need to know what those are. I have created a supplement, I'll put it in the Google Drive, and today we'll look at the essential features of socialist economies. So, same as before, we are still on the same objectives, looking at the different paths to economic development, and in this case, we are looking quite specifically at ideology and governmental planning with regards to the ideological models that they adopt. Kind of because of the ideological model that we are looking at today, the socialist one, we are also going to be looking at the dynamics between the economic agents of the state and the non-state actors. So that will come with our case studies as well. If you need a guiding question for today's lecture on these socialist economies, maybe you can use this one. What are the key features of socialist economic planning, and to what degree are they effective? So our focus over here would still be about effectiveness. Of course, there can be other questions that ask you about importance. So for instance, that question could be about how important was ideology in economic planning. Then you can compare that importance to other factors or other agents. But in this case, I'm looking at the effectiveness of socialist economies. Again, I'm not running economic theory, I'm not writing an econs essay. I am looking at countries that did adopt socialist economic models, and I want to see how they performed. So, with regards to that, this part over here, effectiveness, criteria setting and all that, it leverages from the last set of slides, which I told you about argument frameworks and the kind of criteria that you can use. So today I'll be looking at these two, the red ones over here, short run effectiveness or not non-effectiveness or ineffectiveness, as well as the different degrees of effectiveness among groupings of countries. So that comparative analysis part. So in short, today the two criteria that I'm going to be looking at and using it to frame my argument about the socialist economies is number one, the first one, time, and then the second one is about across space, the comparative analysis part. Okay. So, for instance, the bare bones of the argument for my socialist economies, it looks something like this. Furthermore, there were some countries, so this paragraph appears somewhere in the essay. Furthermore, there were some countries that held unsound economic policies right from the beginning, and the role of the government was counterproductive to the targeted economic objectives. The highly nationalistic and ideological charged socialist economic policies of Burma and Vietnam were prime examples of poor government planning that led to economic decline and political instability. The political instability could lead, further to economic decline as well. So it's like a cycle kind of thing. But over here you can see that I've set it up that there are two case studies in particular that I want to look at, Vietnam and Burma. Both of them adopted socialist economic policies, and that is something that was to their detriment for the most part, as what I said now over here. Later on, my argument will evolve a bit, especially with Vietnam, but we'll get to there later on. But I hope you can see what I'm doing here, looking at the time factor, looking at the start, as well as some consistency in their ineffectiveness, and then the comparative analysis, the space factor, which is I'm looking at two case studies, Vietnam and Burma. This is something that I'm quite proud of your batch for coming up with. It was through your responses and is in combination with my framework that I initially had. But then I think that with some of the responses and all that, we've come together to come up with an acronym of sorts. Does this make sense? COSOT? I don't think so. Like, does it mean anything? I'm not really sure. But I think it's the best that I could come up with. I tried to anagram the whole situation, but I kind of wanted it to come in this sequence. So if it works for you, and if you like acronyms to remember your points or remember the way to structure arguments, this could be one of the ways to do so lah. So we've done this like 1,000 times already by now. Challenges, opportunities, strategies, outcomes, and then the time factor. Looking at the development of the effectiveness across time. Was it the same? Did it get better? Did it get worse? And so on and so forth. Each unique decade or each unique period of time has its own set challenges, has its own set opportunities, has its own set strategies, has its own set outcomes. So I mean, this is the best I can come up with. But now you've seen this framework. If you want to evolve it in some way, and if you have a better way to visualize this framework or this acronym that we have, some cool poster or something like that, please do so and let me have a look at it. I encourage you all to do so. Yeah, especially Jack Kai, if you are listening to this, maybe this is something that you could consider, since you like to do like quick draw, like you like to doodle quick stuff, like just take 30 seconds and see what you can come up with. And for anyone of the matter, or maybe let's make this into a competition. Wow, look, this DJ Anesh podcast series, we are branching out into competitions, man. Not just the SEA Scavenger Hunt, but oh look, now we have a poster making competition as well. Attractive prizes to be won, hopefully sponsored by KFFFFCCCC. Shout out to my sponsors or would-be sponsors, KFC. I hope you're listening in. But yeah, this is something for us to all take note of. On a serious note, this is going to be really useful for us in our argumentation and the way we structure our paragraphs, the way we structure our explanations. Now, as I said, today one of the key focus is us going to kind of learn more about what socialist economic planning is about. What are the key features, the essential characteristics, and things like that. So over here, I have some of the major ones. I think, there might be more, but for the purposes of our study, I think that this is enough. Although, again, feel free to propose more and feel free to ask questions about the nature of socialist economic planning. I think one of the biggest questions that you might already have is, why do I use the word socialist? Why don't I use the word communist economic planning? There's a huge kind of backstory to this whole thing, but in gist, I want you to think about communism and socialism in a spectrum. To the furthest left is communism, right? It's an extreme left kind of political and economic ideology, and the way that it is represented, it seems more that it is an ideal or it is a final goal to be reached. But socialism is further right of the spectrum. That means it's not so left, right? It is a bit further down, and it seems to be what governments of that nature would term their economies as. And socialism seems to be not just the public way to sell this kind of economic model, but I think its emphasis on the people, socialism, its emphasis on the people, its emphasis on welfare, I think that's the way that state officials would rather sell this kind of economic planning, that it is for the people, it is in the interest of the people. Yeah, sure, there may be heavier government intervention, but it is still for the people, for the nation, and things like that. So there's a very strong nationalistic association with socialism, and I think eventually that's why most people kind of just settle on that. Communism, during the Cold War, it's always like negative connotations and all that. But yeah, so socialism is the term that we are going to use. Now, what are the features that we have? Now, socialism, the first big thing that we need to think about is the degree of state intervention. In a socialist economy, the degree of state intervention is quite high as compared to other forms of economy like the capitalist one. So in a socialist economy, you have a high degree of government intervention, and this could come in the form of your normal things like government setting up economic development boards or coordination boards or pumping in investment or doing this, so normal government functions. But I think in a socialist economy, what's the added feature that is seen across many socialist economies is that the government also sets about um, other interventionist measures like deciding upon the output of the country as well as maybe even the prices. So these are things, output and prices, in a capitalist economy, usually they are just determined by market forces. Market forces, put it simply, is just non-state actors, people like you and me buying and selling. If you have a high demand for something and there's a low supply, right? It is likely going to cost a lot of money, but that's market forces. Like give example, let's say the COVID-19 situation now. Just a random example of let's say face masks. Like let's say like this company developed this like awesome face mask and like it's the best shit on earth and things like that. And the supply is very low. Maybe they only produce like 10 face masks, but the demand is like freaking high. So people are willing to pay like $1,000, $2,000 for this face mask. Then let's say for instance a few months down the road, the COVID-19 situation gets better, everyone's cool, we go back to normal. This face mask still exists, right? But its supply it might still be the same, but the demand has lowered already because the emergency situation is not as present. So because of that, the supply remains the same, but the demand is lower. Like people won't be willing to pay like $1,000 for it anymore. They just maybe I'll pay like $200 for it, that kind of stuff. So that's just the law of demand and supply, and long story short, that's called market forces. So you can see that the pricing and the output and all that, it's not really determined by the government, it's determined more by like market forces. But in a socialist economy, sometimes governments can institute their legislation or they can use their authority to set a fixed output as well as a fixed price. That means to say that market forces won't decide lah. It's the government who decides on all these kind of things. What are the merits and demerits of these kind of things? We'll talk about it later. But that's one of the features lah. A heavy degree of governmental intervention. Now there is another feature of this heavy degree of government intervention, and I just want to skip to the third point first: socialist economic planning and the private sector. There is another way in which the government can intervene and do intervene in socialist economic planning. It is what we call the nationalization of industries. The keyword here being the nationalization. Now this is not the same as nationalism. Okay, these are two different things. Nationalization is an economic process or it's an economic strategy. Nationalization basically means that for businesses in the private sector, the government will step in to take over those businesses and run them by the state, run them by the authority. So in a sense, effectively removing the idea of private enterprise, the private sector is going to be subsumed under the state right now. The same thing can happen in agriculture as well. But over there, I think the more common term that they use is collectivization. Now, collectivization is the same concept. The government steps in to the farms, to the whatever, they take it over and then they run it as state enterprises. So the relationship here in a socialist economic model between the government and the private sector is that usually the private sector is going to be subsumed under the state. They won't really function as what we understand of as the private sector. And if they are allowed to exist, it's usually in a very marginal, a very, very small kind of presence. The state would dominate in terms of this kind of dynamics. So again, the merits and the demerits, we'll talk about it later. The second point over here, another feature, the tight and entrenched interdependence and proportioning of resources across ministries and sectors of the economy. This is linked to the first point, where I told you that the government, in its very, very extensive reach over society, it joins forces with all the different ministries, and together, they would run the entire economic machine. And then they would probably like proportion out the resources to where they see fit, which target areas, how much to the population, and so on and so forth. So a lot of it is going to be state run, a lot of it is going to be state controlled, and a lot of it is going to be like state decided lah. And the state in this sense is going to be quite extensive, and it's going to be quite pervasive as well. I don't know if you all have heard this, like maybe in GP or something, about the small g and the big G. So small g is about government, and they play like kind of a backdrop lah to the normal lives of citizens. You know, citizens can normally run their own affairs and all that kind of stuff. But big G is when the government is like those kind of interventionist, heavy-handed government. They intervene down to the private lives of the people. So socialist economic planning seems to resemble more of big G rather than small g. Well, it sounds like rapper names. Big G yo in the house in Vietnam and Burma. You all recovered already from that awesome rap? Cool. Can we continue? Okay, great. Now, the fourth point over here. Another thing that I need you all to layer your understanding of socialist economic planning is that it is further complicated by the grand politics of the Cold War. So it's further complicated by bipolarity, and with our countries, Vietnam and Burma, I think one of the key associations that you would need to think about is the association with the USSR. Vietnam especially. Burma was a special case. Later on we'll see that they chose a path of isolationism. So in fact that was even worse. But Cold War politics does play a part in terms of ideological planning as well. And later on we'll see, whether this was to the benefit or to the detriment of these economies. But the last 2 points over there, socialist economic planning, newly independent context, plus higher focus on social welfare provisions. Now this is what I mentioned at the start, which is that, is there a context? Is there a justification? Is there a purpose for the setup of socialist economic planning? When we did the political theme, right, we asked ourselves, is there a particular justification, a particular context, rationale for the setup of authoritarian regimes? In fact, for some countries, was it a necessity? So in the same way, I want you all to ask the question here as well. Socialist economic planning and the essential features that are there. Is it necessary for the context? Was there an alignment, which is why it prompted governments to adopt those kind of components or features or the model, as a whole? So, that's something that I want you all to think about in order to be fair, to be balanced. So what I mean by balance, right, is that when you want to assess effectiveness, like it can be an ineffective thing, like socialist economic planning. At the end of the day, you can say that, it's pretty shit for these countries. Okay, sure, go ahead. But I think it would be good that before you arrive at that final conclusion, you give some perspective. It could be a sentence or two. Just give some perspective on what's the reason, for the setup, and then later on, what's the problems that came along the way. So it feels that you're being more of a historian that way, where you're giving that argumentative balance, you're giving that historical perspective into, shows that you have good understanding. Okay. Now the first one is Burma. I hope you know this man by now. I'm going to give you like 10 seconds to reflect on who this guy is. You know who? You better know who. Don't tell me some like weird shit name, please. Okay, this is Ne Win. For the most part, we are only going to be looking at two leaders in Burma, U Nu and Ne Win. Mostly also because of the fact that Ne Win remained in power all the way till mostly the end of our time frame. So yeah, for Burma it's quite simple. We just got to look at two leaders. Now, for our context for Burma, when U Nu first comes to power, remember that he comes into power in a really, really chaotic time in Burma. Burma not only has just gotten independence, but the added problem is that Aung San, who was supposed to be the leader of Burma, he got assassinated. So U Nu comes into this kind of vacuum, and soon after the assassination of Aung San and soon after the independence of Burma, what you have is that the problems of the Union of Burma starts to reveal itself. Burma is a union. It is a collection of many different territories being put together into one single entity. And thereafter all these kind of things start. you can recall some of the things that you learned in the theme 1 when we looked at the politics of Burma at this point in time. And you would also remember that UNU's democratic government, is on fragile ground, number one. And number two, it is plagued by a whole host of issues. And democracy just wasn't robust enough, to handle the challenge of independence at that point in time. For our purposes of the economy, over here you can see some issues to do with equity as well as to do with growth. Equity issues, I think most Southeast Asian nations will be facing at that point in time, center periphery issues where the center of power, the capital city or the urban areas, they are usually richer than the rural areas or the peripheral areas. So that's a huge, imbalancing kind of problem, and the disparity seems to be just getting wider and wider, that kind of issues. And then you have other issues to do with growth. Because of the sheer turmoil in the country, governments cannot really focus on the economy. For Burma's case, most of the resources, it's not within Rangoon or Yangon itself, but it's within the areas where it's currently under a bit of instability, all the minority groups areas, and that's where all the resources are. So Burma is a really, really rich, resource-rich country, but the political problems mean that they can't fully maximize it. And not only that, they fall further into economic deterioration. So guys, in this just this simple like narration of the Burmese case, right? You can see the interconnectedness between politics, social side, which is national unity, and economics. So you can see how interrelated they are. That it's like a symbiotic. Oh, hashtag biology. It's a symbiotic relationship between these three spheres, and they mutually affect and they mutually reinforce or they mutually collapse one another. So I did put this in the supplement for last week's stuff. So you can go and think about this further as politics and the social side being key determinants of the economy as well. So I think that's something that I would need you all to consider, certainly in the case study of Burma. But let's continue to look at what UNU did. Remember our S, okay? Our S in COSOT. S is strategies. Now, when I talk to you about strategies, you can take a look at the information over here, especially the evidence. This is the kind of specificity that I would need, where when you want to talk about strategies that they implemented, I would need you to go into such detail. So number one, it talks about the governmental superstructure to support, facilitate, coordinate economic development. So they set up these economic bodies. There's a central bank, there's an economic planning board. The government also injects capital investment into the economy to try to develop it and to kickstart modernization and things like that. Governments also, UNU's government also enacts legislation in order to provide direction, mobilize resources. You see this kind of like evidence, the plan, the Pidotha plan, 1952. This is the kind of things that you want to flex a bit. You all like to flex, right? Hey, Si and Xavier, you all like to flex, This is the kind of things that I want you all to flex about. Jasper as well. I want you to Wei Heng. All your people like to flex on, right? I want you all to flex mentally, intellectually flex these kind of things. Okay, Jin Hao, you also. So we need a gym club for our history batch where we intellectually flex our muscles. So let's get it going. Okay, now I want you all to give the detail of evidence until like this, where this is just for Burma, but you can string together different case studies and you can showcase what the governments did, what are some of the similarities that they had, and so on and so forth. And then the third point over here, economic nationalization to consolidate control over the economy, creation of state monopolies for rice and teak, and then also the Defense Service Institute. So remember what I talked to you all just now about nationalization efforts? This looks like it, where you create control under the state. through the monopolies. Monopolies basically just means that only one person or one group of people are in control, and there isn't much competition out there. So in this case, the state takes control, and there's no competition against the state because there's no private sector lah to speak of. So the state would coordinate, they would disperse, and they would plan and give direction to everything in that sense. So these are the strategies. Then we move on to the outcomes. Now outcomes, with UNU's case, unfortunately, I think you all know by now that it was quite shit. Like, it was quite a disaster lah, to be honest. And it's quite sad for Burma because Burma was that one leader, or rather, it was that one country in Southeast Asia which was poised to be the leader of Southeast Asia. I know we talked a lot about Indonesia and Sukarno and all that kind of stuff, but I think that in the eyes of the international community, especially the Western nations, Burma was a country that they looked out for. And at one point in time, it did seem that Burma was going to be the leader of sorts of Southeast Asia. Don't know about politics, but I think certainly in the economy. You know that one of the earlier SecGens, Yutan, I mean, he's from Burma. I think that gives you some indication as to the kind of international credibility or prestige that Burma had at that point in time, and how distant a memory that is. But for UNU over here, you can see it's quite bad, quite negative trends and so on and so forth. In fact, we talked about historical evidence, and we talked about the idea of always need to evidence statistics. Like, look, if I forget all my statistics, if I have a clean brain as I go into the exam hall, and these 4 points are all that I can raise up, then okay lor, so be it. It's okay. You do evidence outcomes. Are they specific? Do they contain stats? No, not really. But at least you do know and you are historically accurate about the outcomes. So even something as simple as this, I feel that is a baseline as to what you can evidence. Then after that, you bring in, your stats and whatnot, following up from all these things. Let's say, give example like the inflationary trends. Just evidence the inflation like, the value of the Burmese currency fell from like 100% to only 20% of its value, that kind of stuff. Just bring it in. And then it's as simple as that already. And then, with the economic decline, the economic deterioration, it fueled political chaos. The UNU government was really quite factionalized and it was quite incapacitated by this point in time. Over here in this picture, you can see that there's a strike going on in Burma as a response to all these things. So I think, putting all the things together, we can see that the UNU government is not doing well politically, socially, economically. And then that's where, if you remember, Ne Win's caretaker government comes in, when UNU invites the military and invites Ne Win to manage the country and to bring them out of this period of turmoil. To which they do. I mean, they don't solve the problem, definitely not. But I think they do bring about a greater measure of societal order. They do bring about a greater decisiveness to policy making at a time where the situation is really immediate and urgent and severe. So that's what the caretaker government did. Not only that, they also managed to, as I said, FDIs are really important. KFC, hope you're hearing this. FDIs are really important. And what the Ne Win government does is try to get as much of it into the country as possible. Of course, I think you can guess how do they get such money in. I think they're gonna. I'm pretty sure they played up the communist threat and use that to justify increased need for economic assistance or aid to Burma, that kind of stuff. But at the same time, they were still committed to socialist economic planning. So what continued was nationalization efforts and centralization efforts, especially through the various economic sectors that you see over there, through the central body called the Defensive Strategic Institute, the DSI. So you can see the centralization, the nationalization efforts, is on a wide scale. It's like really extensive. So when you see a socialist economy, I think there are very visible indicators to indicate that is a socialist economy. You can't run and hide away from it one. Like with these kind of things, when you see the economic landscape, so much of it is controlled by the government, so much of it is monopolized by the government. I think that it's hard to to deny it lah, or to say otherwise. Yeah, but however, as I said, even with the government coming in, the caretaker government coming in, I don't think that there was a finite solution to the whole thing. In fact, it was just more of like a stopgap measure, because Burma's problems are very real. They are very underlying, and they are very, very structural, and I should say they are very emotional as well. So there are a lot of issues that can't really be settled. The biggest economic one that I feel is still plaguing the government then was the center periphery divides lah, equity issues, and how it seemed as though majority of development and the majority of like revenue and profits and all that was going back to the capital, like Yangon. But the marginal areas, the peripheral areas, they were still suffering from underdevelopment lah. And so it kind of resembled a situation of exploitation. One of the most common sentiment from the Burmese perimeter areas, right? The Burmese frontier areas, the peripheral areas, the minority groups where they all are at, is that they saw this new country of Burma, the Union of Burma, right, as a colonization by the Burmese people. So there are all these kinds of fears that they were going to be subjected to Burmese rule. And I think to some extent their fears are justified lah. Because you can see the economic situation, the center periphery divide is still present, and in some cases, in fact, it's getting worse in this case lah. Yeah, so the country is still in a state of political and social turmoil, and as a result, the economy suffers lah, because they at the elite decision making, at the elite leadership levels, there's a lot of stalemate, there's a lot of impasse over there. So what happens is that when Ne Win comes into power, the permanent one, when he comes into power in 1962, when he overthrows the UNO government and all that, these are the various strategies that he set about doing lah. I think in general, it's more of the same, just at a more intense and a faster speed. Nationalization, centralization, you can see lah. Agriculture became highly controlled, and so on and so forth. There is this slogan that would characterize the economy, the Burmese way to socialism. And you can see point D over there, an inward-looking policy that revolved around state central planning, state ownership of the large sectors of the economy, with all those industries over there. So you can see, like what I said lah, it's an increased intensity, it's an increased scale, increased speed of the centralization and the nationalization and the collectivization efforts. Another key feature of Burma under Ne Win is its relationship to the international sector. And unfortunately for Burma, and what followed after that, is that there were heavy restrictions imposed upon Burma with regards to international trade. This really stemmed from Ne Win's belief that capitalism was in a sense evil lah, and that capitalism was bringing a lot of ills to society, and the Burmese traditional way of life and society is suffering under such modern forms of influences and blah blah blah. So anyway, long story short, he brought Burma into isolationism in terms of not just politics, but also in terms of economic trade and international cooperative networks and things like that. So Burma entered into this phase of economic isolationism, and based on what you already know about industrialization, export-oriented markets, trade, and so on and so forth, FDIs and all that, you know that once you cut out the external sector, your economy is going to suffer massively. So that was kind of one of the major problems lah, with regards to that kind of decision that was being made. So you can see that Burma, once upon a time, slated to take up leadership of Southeast Asia, now just retreating back into its own country, to create that kind of self-sufficiency, but in a very isolated sense. So that is one of the extremes lah, in which Ne Win took socialist economic planning. So on that note, I want to clarify that socialist economic planning doesn't say let's go into isolationism, or socialist economic planning doesn't say let's break out from international trade, or let's be by ourselves and all that kind of stuff. No, it doesn't. Socialist economic planning prides itself on this concept of self-sufficiency, but usually it's self-sufficiency in the context of continuing relationships with other countries. But in this case, when it came to Burmese isolationism, I think we do have to factor in the personality of the leader in bringing it to such an extreme. So, in a sense, twisting or bastardizing socialist economic principles and merging it with his own views of anti-Western, anti-foreign, anti-capitalist kind of slants, and then the end product, the baby, is this thing called Burmese isolationism. So I want you all to note lah that sometimes it's about the ideology, but at the same time, sometimes it's a mix between the ideology and the leader's personality. Sometimes it's wholly the leader's personality, but there are different combinations and that kind of stuff lah. So that's a note about Burmese isolationism and Ne Win's role in that. I think this comes as no surprise, but the economic outcomes are quite shit. In fact, arguably, it might be comparable with Yunus or even worse and that kind of stuff. So the comparative advantages that Burma had in resources, I guess you could say that they were all, it's a missed opportunity lah. And a lot of it went underutilized, underdeveloped. A lot of it was mismanaged. There was a lot of corruption going on, and therefore the Burmese economy just never got steam lah, in that sense. And till today, Burma is still emerging out of its isolationist period, and only today are we seeing Burma starting to establish that kind of relationship, starting to open itself up to the world. But you can see lah, it took a really long time to recover from this economic policy that was done all the way back in the 1960s. So there was, I do have to acknowledge lah, like sometime during the 80s there was some attempts at economic reform, and when I say economic reform, I mean introducing some elements of capitalism, to do with private sector growth, or to do with establishing some sort of trade relationships and all that kind of stuff. But I think that there wasn't a political will to really open Burma up, and there wasn't really a big political will to decentralize power as well. The military, Ne Win, even after the 1988 revolutions, they still continued to hold firmly in power, and I think they just did not have that political will to open Burma up, or to change certain economic structures. It was still pretty much a very highly centralized, highly nationalized kind of economic system they had over there. And for all the growth in democracy, there wasn't a corresponding change effected in the economic sphere, at least not within our time frame lah. So Burma is one of those case studies, or it's a sad case study where from the start to the end it was pretty bad in terms of its strategies, in terms of its outcomes. The opportunities that were there weren't really leveraged on, and to the detriment of the government and especially to the people. So that's something to consider in terms of your framework when you think about time and your argumentation. Okay, come, let's take a break. Get a breather if you need to. We'll go for a commercial break. I hope you like this one, and I will see you guys when we get back.
Look at the size of this thing. It's huge. And it looks yummy too. Should I? I'm going in. Oh gosh. KFC Mighty Zinger. Big on size, bigger on taste.
Do you hear that? Go grab your KFC, guys. KFC, if you see a surge in demand today, it's thanks to me. And hope you contact me soon. I've been leaving you a lot of missed calls, and I haven't got any in return. Maybe my phone is broken. I'll check it again later. But yeah, waiting on your call back.
What's up, Hakas? Welcome to the very first edition of crap, my bad. What's up, Hakas? Welcome to the very first edition of
Hakas Fitness. Hakas and fitness going together, who would have thought? Not me, man.
Right now. I've got my man Xavier right here. So Xavier, what's the first exercise?
It's a very, very simple workout. This exercise, even Mr. Cole can do it. It's the classic push-up. Let us get rid of our virtual backgrounds first. Let's get down to it. How many push-ups will we be doing today, see?
Right, so we're gonna keep it simple. Let's just do 12.
12 push-ups. You got it, my man.
So let's get started, my man.
We get in position. Alright. Right. Easy.
Moving on to tricep dips. So get yourself a chair and let's get started.
Tell me, see, what if I don't have a chair?
You can do it anywhere, bro. You can do it on your bed, any surface, my man.
Oh, I have a bed.
Right
Let's
there.
do it on that.
Right there.
Yes. How many dips?
12 reps.
12 reps. You got it. Let us begin.
Doing good, my man.
I'm just doing just fine, man. Quarantine ain't got nothing on me. Nothing on Hakas.
Oh, are we gonna skip leg day today, my man?
No, only historians never skip leg day.
What are we gonna do now, my man?
So we will be doing the classic squat.
Alright,
Let's raise our angles a bit. Let's go. Get that perfect form. Oh, I'm quite tired.
Yeah, man. Just got one last exercise.
What will we be finishing off with?
Let's finish it off with a plank, man.
Oh, I'm so glad I have you to do the plank with, man.
We got through that, my man.
Right, I got you.
Sick.
Yes.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
Would you like to play a game of rock, paper, scissors, my man?
Sure.
Oh. Scissors, paper, stone. Ah. Oh, wow. I am just so exhausted from that intense workout. Tell me,
There we go.
will we be able to do this every day?
Yeah, absolutely. You can do this anytime, anywhere. Easy workout. 4 simple exercises.
You know what? No matter how difficult the workout is, it's always easier with you, bro.
Got you, my man.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
Alright, well,
Hakas gotta stay united as one Hakas. Yeah.
let's kick some Hakas.
Oh,
Oh, is that allowed? I'm not even sure.
I think we just do a proper ending. What you want to say?
The eye of the tiger.
Okay, guys, welcome back. Welcome back. Oh, sorry, that's just me feasting on my KFC. Oh, that rhymes. Maybe I should do a KFC rap. Maybe that will gain their attention. Just an update: KFC has still not called me back yet. I feel like a lost lover waiting for his partner to, call back and give me some explanation as to why there's been this distance so far. Hello, guys. Welcome back. Welcome back. I'm back. Now, we're going to talk about Vietnam, and we are going to be talking about if there are certain similarities with the Burmese case study that we saw before the break, and or whether there was some nuance in this case study that we need to consider. Similarly, I will need you to think back about the socialist economic features and the essential characteristics and things like that in our assessment of this case study. Vietnam is one of my favorite case studies to talk about because it's so dynamic, this country, and this country has been through so much trauma, but yet there's this kind of like fighting spirit, and it's this kind of in a sense there is a kind of pragmatism to the way they do things as well, and definitely there is a lot of nationalism in this country. So yeah, one of the cool case studies to think about. Now, for Vietnam, I think whenever we mention Vietnam, we think about the Vietnam War. In fact, the international community has always associated Vietnam with the Vietnam War, and that's all they think about when they think about Vietnam. To such an effect that I think a decade or two ago, one of the Vietnamese ministers, I think he was speaking at some forum or like some interview, and he said, Vietnam is a country, not a war. And I thought that, wow, that really resonated with me because, yeah, we always think, oh, the Vietnam War, and usually we see from the American perspective, but I think, it's as much the people's history, the Vietnamese people's history, as it is one about the Cold War. So, yeah, I think Vietnam is one of those cool case studies. But with regards to economics and the war, I think you can probably foresee what I'm about to say, that it's just a massively crazy ass time that there's a war going on. So in terms of the economy, it's going to be very, very, very disrupted. And whatever that is going on in that economy is probably going to be geared towards war as well. Which is why North Vietnam has such a rich tradition, or has such a rich foundation in industry and heavy industry especially. So that's something that I just want you all to consider, that war, it would devastate economies, but in a sense it would also structure economies. And the Cold War has an added element to this, because in the Cold War there is a certain relationship between industry and the Cold War. So this is actually one of the questions that I want to take it up with you all in tutorials, which is what seems to be the relationship between industry and the Cold War. There is a special relationship between these two, and I want to explore that in tutorials. So have a think about it, and then when I meet you all in tutorials, we will be discussing this question. So with regards to the Vietnam War, another angle to consider as well is that there is the role of external powers. So in a sense, external money is coming in. If you want to think about it, it's just a really, really loose way to think about foreign direct investment. I think this is more about like war assistance and all that kind of stuff, rather than any genuine form of a developmental plan. But nonetheless, money is still coming in. So again, war is shit lah, and it's miserable. But at the same time, there's a lot of dynamism that's happening in a war situation, and I would get you all to consider that as well. With regards to the challenge and the objectives, when the war finally ends in 1975, quite clearly the immediate task is to recover from the war and to re-establish relations between the North and the South, especially in terms of the economic functions and the economic resources as well. I want you all to see that even though we consider Vietnam from 1975, in a sense that's when the country is reunified as one, and its immediate task is to recover from the war, you can group Vietnam with other case studies like Indonesia, when Sukarno had to recover from Dutch decolonization, maybe even Burma, as UNO had to recover from the demonstrations and disruptiveness in the Burmese decolonization period as well. So I think my point here is that there are a number of governments who had disruptive decolonization processes, and their immediate economic aim was to recover from the war. The short-term aim was that you can then do your measurements of effectiveness about how well they did that. Besides the economic issues, I mean, definitely there's the point about getting the two territories together once again, the North and the South, reunification issues. Again, it's a really, really nationalistic and emotional element to this reunification. So as much as there is an economic dimension, there is a political dimension as well. How cohesive can this new country be under a communist banner? Because you must remember now that there's no more like 17 parallel, no more North and South. It is one united Vietnam under the North. And the problem with that is that the South, there's still significant portions of the South that resents communist rule, or at least they fear what kind of repercussions are going to befall upon them with the communist North now ruling over the entire country. The South, many of them were pro-democracy and blah blah blah. So there's this great period of uncertainty there. So even to marshal the entire nation together, to come up with some sort of cohesive economic plan, to manage the resources well, and so on and so forth, all these kind of things are at the forefront of their agenda. So with regards to strategies, what kind of things did they have? Quite similar to Burma, you can see a lot of superstructure kind of plans and superstructure actions. There are central economic development boards. There is the injection of investment capital. There are things, I'll deal with this in a while, but there are things to do with 5-year plans and industrialization processes. And of course, there is nationalization and collectivization. Now, going back to the second point over there, you can see the 5-year plans and all that kind of stuff. Now, the 5-year plans or 8-year plans or 2-year plans or how many year plans, right? This is not exclusively a socialist provision. Like, I mean, it's just a target setting kind of thing lah. It's not really exclusive to socialist economies. However, a lot of socialist economies, they would conceive of such plans, and it's very closely associated lah with socialist economies back then. 5-year plans and things like that. I think the first one was in like Russia itself, and in the modern era, the first one is in Russia itself, and that was linked to agriculture and later on industrialization. Same thing over here. We have like how many year plans or whatever, and then they are being implemented. This is further evidence of state planning, state direction, state control. Is a key feature of the socialist economy. Again, these plans are there, but whether or not they are well conceived or whether or not they are flawed, I think that's something to debate and to think about, because you can set about a plan but whether or not the plans are realistic and whether or not they are achievable, do you have sufficient capital? Do you have economic support? Is the infrastructure there? 1,001 different permutations as to whether or not this plan will go well. And you can see for Vietnam in this period of time, the 5-year plans, I think, mixed results, but leaning towards the negative trends lah. Lack of funds, and, external powers are pulling out of the region, not as interested as before. Unrealistic targets. technological backwardness, low labor productivity, insufficient domestic consumption. I also want you to consider that at this point in time, in the 80s, leading all the way to 1991, there is another big conflict going on with Vietnam, and that is the Cambodian invasion. So even that, there's a huge degree of political uncertainty and turmoil as well, and that might have figured into why Vietnam was not economically performing well. At this point in time, the Cold War is still going on, so in terms of international trade, they are also quite closed off and quite restricted. I think that they are mostly trading with socialist bloc countries rather than, you know, the entire international community. So, you know, that's another restriction with regards to the external sector of the economy, not contributing as much as it can have if you have an open economy, like let's say Singapore's, for instance. So this is where the Cold War kind of rears its ugly head, because with bipolarity and with, you know, alignment and all that kind of stuff, in a sense, certain economies will be restricted in their trade partners, and that could be well to the detriment of their economy. However, Vietnam, different from Burma, is that Vietnam has a shift in its trajectory, has a shift in its ideological economic planning sometime in 1986, where in the fourth five-year plan, that was a mouthful, in the fourth five-year plan, it usually is called the Doi Moi period. Now, Doi Moi just means an openness to the economy. And what happened over there is that the Vietnamese leadership, they recognized that being too ideologically committed to socialist economic planning wasn't doing them well. And at that point in time, in 1986, you can already start to see the slow collapse of the USSR, economically speaking. Like, socialist economic planning is seen to be failing. The Vietnamese leadership, the VCP, the Vietnamese Communist Party, they are cognizant of such trends, they are cognizant of such flaws, and so on and so forth. And at this point in time, I would say at an appropriate juncture, they recognized that it was opportune for them to switch policy tracks. And the Doi Moi period represents a greater movement towards capitalism. Now, not my phrasing, I say a greater movement towards capitalism. I didn't say that, they jumped into capitalism. I think it was more of a gradual process, that kind of stuff. So there's greater privatization, greater links with international trade. Decentralization means to say that the private sector has that opportunity and that space to grow, and so on and so forth. And with regards to the stats, the outcomes, there were positive trends that were emerging from the Doi Moi period all the way to the year 2000. So it's more of a situation where they largely still abide by a socialist framework. I think the degree of state intervention is still quite high, but with regards to opening spaces in the private sector with international trade, they are giving that kind of space and that opportunity. And with regards to that, it seemed to do them well. And this is the significant departure from the Burmese case study, where Burma is like seen from start to end is like quite bad, but Vietnam, it seems to be, after a certain point, there seemed to be a marked improvement towards greater economic development and greater economic success. The last thing that I have for you guys is actually I've withheld a third socialist economic planning country, and I kind of want to also discuss that at tutorials. So I want you to go and find this out. We'll have a look at this, and I want you to tell me about the COSOT with regards to this case study over here. And then if you can do that, then together we have 3 case studies for the socialist economic planning ones. So 2 questions that I want you all to think about. What's the relationship between industry and the Cold War? And then over here, the third case study, I want you all to find that out and tell me about its trajectory, or tell me about its level of effectiveness, and so on and so forth. Okay? So I will see you guys during tutorials. Thank you once again for hearing DJ Anesh out. I hope that you guys are doing well. I miss you guys, and I hope to see you guys real soon. In the meantime, do take care. Always contact me when you need, and I'll try my best to accede to whatever requests that you all have. I hope all the supplementary material is good as well, and let me know if you need anything more. I'll be happy to do stuff for you guys. Yeah, so thanks guys. I will see you again. DJ Anesh out.